Let me share my screen and hopefully I can choose the right one. That's right. Okay.
Oh, I should mention everyone to mute. I see a couple that are still unmuted, so just make sure you reply to that. Thanks.
So does everybody see a giant SQL Solutions Group logo?
I do not.
Still see you.
You see me. Interesting. Okay.
I actually see two of you on the meeting.
Share screen. That's weird. It even has the, how about that?
There we go.
Okay. All right. We are ready to roll. Okay, this presentation, this is a webinar that I did a couple of months ago that I think Adam attended, is how we got connected, and emailed me and said, hey, would you be interested in giving this to our user group? And I said, sure. So simplify SQL Server migrations with dbatools. And just from a standpoint of the webinar series that this came from, this was actually kind of a part 2. So we did a webinar on preparing for migration, and then this was more implementation. But we'll review, some of those things as well. A little bit about my company and then myself. In fact, let's go in that order. My name is Randy Knight. I'm a Microsoft Certified Master, if you happen to know what that is. I've been doing SQL Server for way longer than I like to admit. Started with SQL Server 6.0. Obviously, the product has changed a lot since then. And I've done a whole bunch of different things. I spent probably the most recognizable. I spent 6 years as a database architect for Match.com. So I always tell people it's definitely the most interesting data and most interesting company that I've ever worked at. So that's me. I started this company, SQL Solutions Group, in 2010 as what they call a boutique consultancy. We're a Microsoft partner in the data platform. There's a couple of others as well. I probably need to update that, application integration and a few other things. We're a consultancy / database managed service provider, I guess is the best way to put it. So we do, time and materials projects. We have a remote DBA managed service. We do health checks. And then finally, we have a coaching program, or a coaching mentoring program. Less formal training and more working with you to work through issues and areas that you might need some help. So that's us. As I mentioned, we're a small company, but we're growing. We have 5 employees now, and I'm ready to add another senior consultant. So if you or anybody is very senior at SQL Server and is interested in consulting, would love to make that connection. Okay, what we're going to talk about in this presentation, we'll talk about the different types of migrations that you can do. What are some of the challenges that you'll run into? Do's and don'ts. What do we need to migrate? Obviously, databases are the biggest thing that we're migrating, but it is certainly not all of it, right? So we'll talk about all the different things that you need to be thinking about when you're migrating from one server to another. We'll talk a little bit about compatibility levels, because that's important, and it's one that I would go so far as to say is almost always missed in upgrades. And then the dbatools PowerShell module. If you're not familiar with that, if you take nothing else away from this presentation, it would be to go check out the dbatools site and start playing with those commands, because it's a complete game changer for DBAs. On the Slack channel one day, someone had just gotten into it and they said, I feel like I'm cheating at my job because it makes things so much easier. So that's that. All right, migration types. On-premise is primarily what we're talking about. You could be doing a version upgrade. You could be doing a consolidation. Maybe it's, new hardware, or, even if it's not new hardware, it's a new VM because, we've had this thing forever and we're not sure what's going on with everything. Or it could be a migration to the cloud. For the purposes of this presentation and migrating to the cloud with dbatools, really what we'd be talking about is IaaS, or infrastructure as a service, meaning running SQL Server 2019 or whatever on-premise version on a VM in the cloud, whether that be AWS or Azure or GCP or wherever you happen to have your VMs. And there are some things that you have to think about in the cloud environment when you're setting up those VMs. But ultimately, from a DBA's perspective, if you're running SQL Server on a VM in the cloud, it's not that different than running it in your data center, right? You're just using Microsoft's data center. Platform as a service migration is a completely different animal, right? If you're wanting to go from on-premise to Azure SQL DB, Synapse Analytics, one of the RDS serverless offerings from Amazon, the way that you would accomplish that is very different. So we're really talking about the on-premise product, whether that's running on a VM in the cloud or locally. What are some of the challenges that we run into for migrations? First one is, what do we have, right? I'm sure everybody has their IT environment expertly documented, and when you come in and you start a new job, everything's there. Everyone knows exactly what everything is, and there are no questions, right? Obviously, I'm being facetious there. Many times, we have this database server that's been around for a long time, and there's different databases on that, different jobs, different things, and a lot of times, there may not be the institutional knowledge of what everything is. If you have that all documented, if you're using a CMDB, more power to you. But more often than not, we run into stuff like that. What's going to break, right? When we migrate, what are the things that are going to break? And what happens a lot of times is, particularly from a developer's perspective, we think about the database and the logins and the connection string, right? So if the host name changes, I'm going to have to update connection strings. But anybody who's been a DBA for any amount of time knows there's an awful lot of things on a SQL server that we have to think about and that potentially could break when we move to a new server or a new version. And that brings us to risk reward and cost benefit. And we see in my company, we see a lot of old versions of SQL Server. There's still a bunch of 2008 R2 out there, even though it went out of support last year. And we're coming up on end of life for 2012 next year. But people are very hesitant to mess with their SQL servers, I guess is a better way to put it. And I think it's the risk versus the reward. They see it as a high risk endeavor, rightly so. And the cost, and what do I really get out of that? And if there's not a new feature in a version that we really want to use, that developers are pushing for, it's awfully easy to continue to back burner or deprioritize these upgrade projects, right? what it really all comes down to, in my opinion, is fear, right? Every time we go and try to upgrade and migrate a database, we have nothing but problems. There's reports that we didn't know about that, people are running. There's, analysts with, there's 2,000 Excel spreadsheets out there with, you know, data links in them, and those connections are all going to have to change, whatever the case may be, right? It really comes down to fear. And to me, that's why this exercise is important. And again, this is more the prior one that I did on using the data migration assistant and going through and figuring out what you have. But those are, what we see as some of the biggest challenges. Do's and don'ts. When you are going to migrate from one server to another, for a version upgrade is the most common reason, use the opportunity to clean up the environment. We all have environments with, old logins for users that are no longer with the company, old jobs, databases that should be decommissioned. Maybe we have a SQL server that has other things on it, right? Over time, someone needed a file share, and so they put this file share on this SQL server, and now we have all these files, and we got to deal with that as part of our migration. So decide what you want it to look like going forward, and use the opportunity to clean it up rather than just say we're going to move everything and take our problems with us. Make sure that everything you're doing is implemented on the new server per best practices. There's an awful lot of things that we like to make sure are set up correctly for a new SQL server, many of which are, things that Microsoft doesn't even tell you, right? Things like most DBAs know, we want to have transaction logs and data on different volumes. But things like 64K NTFS allocation unit size in a virtual environment, there's a whole bunch of VMware stuff if you're using VMware that you want to do for databases. So just, use the opportunity to say, hey, let's start from a solid foundation. Security hardening is a great one. Right? One of the things we always look at in our health checks is, who are all the users that are sysadmins? And it's usually a lot bigger list than it necessarily needs to be. So again, what are the permissions? What are the logins? Who actually needs what? Things like, running SQL Server under a local administrator account, which is not necessary and not advisable. We're actually recommending group GMSAs, group managed service accounts, to run your SQL Server instances at this time. So that would be a great thing to look at in implementing this new environment. We want to approach a migration, and we look at this as an infrastructure-y kind of thing, and so we don't necessarily approach it the same way. But we want to say, we're going to go through these same steps that we do with development projects or with other projects that, we need analysis, design, and then implementation, right? We don't want to be just kind of willy-nilly, hey, well, let's just move everything over a weekend and we'll figure out what breaks and fix it on the fly, right? Go through this process. Make sure that you know exactly what's going to happen. And then finally, test, right? We should be doing these migrations multiple times probably before we actually go live with it. Make sure that we test all the applications and just that process of considering all the different reports and things that use the database that maybe we sometimes don't think about. Right, we think about the applications it supports and their app servers, but maybe there's some integrations, maybe there's some SSIS packages out there or other types of integrations. So just making sure that we test everything. Some of the don'ts. Don't install unnecessary components. I can't tell you how many SQL servers I've seen with everything installed from the installer. Whoever installed it just clicked everything, right? So it has reporting services, analysis services, SSIS. We usually put SSIS on most boxes because it's pretty prevalent. But don't install reporting services or analysis services or replication or all these optional components if you're not going to use them, right? Because for two reasons. One, it's just unnecessary overhead and complexity. And there's also the concept and security of an attack surface area, right? And the more services you have running, the larger your surface area is going to be for attacks. And then I guess the third one would be when a new DBA does come along and inherits this server, if all these services are installed, they're either going to assume they're being used or they're going to have to go figure out if they are or not. Avoid in-place upgrades. I do not like in-place upgrades. They sound good, they sound easy, but you're just bringing a lot of your problems along with you. And the biggest thing is that there's no easy rollback from that, right? If you have a new server, new VM that you're migrating everything to, even at the time of your go live, you're going to have a go, no go up with your testing. And if that unfortunately ends up being no go, all you've got to do is point everyone, back at the original server. And so really prefer not to do in-place upgrades. I don't like restoring system databases, master, MSDB, reporting services. Some people consider report server, tempdb as system databases. I wouldn't include those here. Really, I'm talking about master and MSDB. Restoring MSDB, again, it seems like an easy way to get all your jobs and everything's migrated. But again, you're kind of taking your garbage with you. And we're going to see with dbatools that it's just as easy or even easier to migrate those things without restoring system databases. All right, what are all the things that we need to think about when we're going to perform a migration? Common things that everybody has and that people tend to think of: databases, logins, SQL agent jobs, alerts, operators, credentials. If you're using things like SQL agent proxies, then you need to make sure that the credentials associated with that. Database mail configuration, right, for your agent notifications, or if you're using database mail from inside some of your applications, stored procedures, whatnot. Replication, if you have replication in place as a publisher, distributor, or subscriber, you need to take that into account. How much data are we talking about? Are we going to try to move the distribution database? Are we going to recreate all the publications? Can we repush everything as part of this, or do we need to try to do this in a more seamless way? Extended event sessions. If you have XEs in place, make sure you grab all of your extended event sessions and get those over to the new server. Linked servers. At least evaluate what non-defaults you have configured in your SP configure or sysdoc configurations, because some of them may have been chosen for a reason in your old environment. What I would say on this one is take this as an opportunity to review all of those and set them appropriately for the new environment rather than just copying everything, right? If you're on a new version of SQL Server, new operating system, potentially different hardware, things like max degree of parallelism, max mem, are going to be different, right? And there may be some things that you did in the past on older versions that you no longer need to do, right, to work around some of the issues. Some of the less common things that you need to at least evaluate and say, hey, do I have some of this out there? Instance level triggers, server audits and audit specifications, maintenance plans. We tend not to use the built-in SQL Server maintenance plans, but if you are using those, you're going to need to make sure you get those migrated. If you have any custom endpoints, service broker, things like that. If there are user objects in system databases, this one's a big gotcha. You know, best practice is to not create any user objects in system databases, especially master, right? And what most people will do is have a user database called DBA or, you know, something like that, that if we have objects that are DBA related, they're, you know, maintenance jobs. Maybe I'm using Ola Hallengren's maintenance plans and it has a table and a bunch of stored procedures and functions. You know, put those in that DBA database rather than in your system databases. Other features of SQL Server that are less common that might be in use: policy-based management, resource governor, change tracking, change data capture. This could be a lot bigger list, but I think you get the idea. Okay. And then the last thing here before we jump into DBA tools is compatibility levels. If you don't know what this is, every SQL Server database has a compatibility level associated with it. This is at the database level, so it has nothing to do with the instance, has nothing to do with individual, you know, queries, store procedures, things like that. It's at the database level. If you take a database from an older version of SQL Server and you restore it to a newer version of SQL Server, it does not change the compatibility level automatically. And there's a good reason for that. And to understand that, we need to talk about what the compatibility level is and what it is not. There's a misconception out there that the compatibility level makes your database act like it's on that version 100%. That the optimizer will work the same, and that's not the case. What it does is it's all about the T-SQL language and what is supported. So if there are deprecated features that have been removed from a version of SQL Server that you're using, if you change the compatibility level, you're not going to be able to use those with an upgraded compatibility level. Conversely, you know, maybe you went to the latest and greatest SQL Server because you were excited about JSON support in the database engine. Well, you're not going to be able to use that functionality in your T-SQL if you don't have your compatibility level set correctly. So a lot of times what happens is either we don't know about this at all, and so it just gets missed, or more commonly, we know about it, but from a regression testing standpoint, we say, you know what, let's leave this like it is for now and change it later. The problem is that later never comes. And as a very real situation, this table shows you the versions, what's the default for that version, and what compatibility levels does that version support. And that's the important part. Take a look at the very bottom there. SQL Server 2000 was compatibility level 80. We had multiple customers who had 2008 R2 servers when we were going through all the 2008 R2 upgrades last year with databases in a compatibility level of 80. Well, if you take a look at that, what was the last version that supported 80? 2008 R2. So now to upgrade to 2016, 2019, whatever it is you happen to be going to, you're going to have to deal with those compatibility levels, right? And they go quite a ways back, right? So 2019 goes all the way back to 2008 R2. You know, that SQL 2000, you know, went through 2008 R2. right? Which, 2008 as a year is a little bit of a misnomer because, this went end of extended support last year, right? So we're talking about a compatibility level that was 20 years old that was still supported, right? And that was kind of the message to those customers is that, you've had 20 years to deal with this. At some point, you have to make that change. So it's an important thing to make sure that you take into account as part of your migration.
Excuse me,
Okay.
I think you had a typo, or are there two different versions of level 90 on that chart on your 2008? Three lines up, you've got 190 and 90 again. Is that supposed to be an 80 there?
That is a good, yes. Yes,
Okay.
it should. You're right. Good.
I wasn't sure if there was two different versions of 90 or not, but I was forgetting about it. Okay,
that's a good catch. Because yeah, 2008 and 2008 R2 should be the same. So I will have to fix that slide. All right, any other questions or things to discuss before we move on to DBA tools? Okay, so DBA tools is a community PowerShell module. It's open source. It's out on GitHub, and it is a complete game changer, like I said, in terms of SQL Server administration. PowerShell's been around for a long time now, and a lot of DBAs had already started to get into PowerShell, but I'm seeing a mass move to start learning and using PowerShell just based upon DBA tools, because it makes a lot of things that we do much, much easier. As of the time I put this deck together in February, there were 600 commands available. There's probably more now. It's on a pretty fast release cycle. Like I said, if this is your only reason to get on the PowerShell bus, this is enough of a reason. So what we're going to do, in the demo in just a minute, we're going to jump in, and most of this DBA tool stuff is going to be demo because it's just a lot easier to show. And I'm going to take a look at, how do I go about, if there's 600 commands, and I don't remember the one that I need, how do I go about figuring that out? And this little snippet of PowerShell right here can potentially be your best friend, not just for DBA tools, but for any module. Because what it's doing is saying get command, which will give me a list of all the commands I have available, limiting it to that module, and then I'm sending that through the pipeline to a grid view, which allows me to sort and filter and do whatever I need to do to find the commands that I'm looking for. It's obvious, it's very well documented as well. dbatools.io is the website for the project. If you go to docs.dbatools.io, they're auto-generated docs, and they're very good. Okay, so what are the things that we can move with DBA tools? Databases, logins, database mail, credentials, jobs, alerts, and operators, and a couple things here, right? Like, when you talk about logins or linked servers is another one. One of the hassles with a migration is, do I know the passwords for all of these, and do I have to create them with a password? And if I use SQL Server to script out the objects, it doesn't take the password with it, right? So these tools use SMO under the hood, SQL management objects, and so they take all of that along the way. If you have a central management server, there's a way to migrate that. It will grab everything from your sys configurations. Again, you want to be a little bit careful with that one, but it can be done. You can look for user objects in system databases, instance level triggers, backup devices, audits, audit specifications, endpoints, extended events, policy-based management, resource governor, custom error messages. If you're using the what they call it, management data warehouse data collectors. It will move those, startup procedures. You know, it's a pretty exhaustive list. And the thing to think about here is that that's, you know, that matches pretty closely to that list of all the things we had to look at. And, you know, I was talking to a customer just today who said, hey, you know, we're setting up a UAT environment for this application. We've restored the databases from production and you know, fixed the orphan logins. Is there anything else that we have to think about? Right, again, databases and logins are what people think about that's on a SQL server, but there's potentially a lot of things that you need to migrate. Okay, the rest of this will primarily be demo. We're going to review migration related commands and how we look at those. And we're going to migrate from a 2008 R2 instance to a 2019 instance in one click, taking all those things into account. So let's switch over to PowerShell. I'm using PowerShell ISE here instead of Visual Studio Code. That's what I opened in, no particular reason. So what I've got two VMs here that I'm connected to, demo SQL 2K8 R2 and demo SQL 2019. The 2019 is a brand new install. It's been set up for best practices. It's got all the things in place, but there's no databases. There's a couple of logins, but not really. There's my login is about the only one. There's no jobs, database mail hasn't been configured, etc. Right? The 2008 R2 instance is the source. So, and again, these are demo machines, so this doesn't have the volume of things that you would have in a real world environment, but I put enough in here so that you can kind of see the different pieces. So we have maintenance jobs installed. You're probably familiar with what these look like if you use Ola Hallengren's maintenance plan. We've got some default alerts set up. These are very important alerts to have, by the way. Those are going to let you know if you have disk corruption early on. There's a DBA operator, which tells me that, you know, we have database mail configured. I did not do a proxy or any credentials. I could have. We have, I thought that I had a link server. I do not. All right. And then a couple of AdventureWorks databases, right? AdventureWorks and AdventureWorks DW. Those are both the 2008 R2 version of those databases. All right, so that's our demo environment, 2008 R2, 2019. So let's go back over to PowerShell here. And the first thing I have here, I've got a couple of variables, source instance, destination instance, with those two instances. I've already started the VMs and all that. And I don't know how familiar everybody is here in this group with PowerShell, so I'm gonna go pretty low level. And if you feel it's too dumbed down, then tell me, hey, we already know all that. So the first thing we see here is something called splatting. If you have a lot of parameters to send to a PowerShell command, this is a great way to clean up your code a little bit and make that easy. And what it is a hash table, which is in PowerShell, it's just a collection. We define that with the @ sign and the curly braces. And then I'm setting up just a bunch of key value pairs. So splat.source, source instance, destination, destination instance. How do I want to copy my databases over to the new instance? I can either do backup restore, or I can do detach attach. We're going to use backup restore. The other thing I guess I should have said in the slides, what we're talking about here is a so-called, normal instance with reasonable sized databases that you can migrate all at once, right? If you have large databases that take a long time to back up and to restore, or you have perhaps just very limited downtime window that, the databases aren't that huge, but I got to do this thing in an hour. Then we're going to look at doing some usually log shipping, right? Where we establish log shipping from the source to the destination. And then our go live really becomes recovering log shipping and making the changes to connection strings and whatnot to go to the new instance. So backup restore, there's a bunch of parameters that we need specifically for backup restore. The shared path, so we need a UNC file share that both instances have access to. We're going to restore with replace. We're going to recover the databases. We're not establishing log shipping, so we don't need no recovery. And just a couple of other of those parameters. Post-migration state. After I have performed this migration, are there things I want to do on the source to make sure that we are using only the target? What I'm doing here is I'm going to make all the databases on the source read-only so that you can go and look at what's there, but you can't write to it. So if we've missed a connection string. Now, from a reporting standpoint, you might say, well, people could be reporting on stale data as well. That's true. Some people go ahead and just take the databases offline, or my preferred approach, if you are concerned about that, would be to rename those databases on the source. So you've got a bunch of read-only databases that are, original database name _ RO or something like that. Because then if someone does have a connection that's been used to connecting to that database, it's not going to work. But they're still, it's accessible to you because true or false, someone's going to say, hey, this used to work and now it doesn't, and you're going to want to be able to go refer in that database and see what's going on. I also like to disable the jobs. In this case, I'm saying leave them disabled on the destination, do not disable them on the source. And I think I want them disabled on both. When I migrate jobs, whether it's a few jobs or whether it's an entire instance, I like to go just do a quick sanity check review before I enable them. I might want to not run some jobs that are on the schedule right now until we've gotten through our testing, whatever the case may be, but you can control that if you want to disable the jobs. And then there's a few other ones around the behavior. Force, I want verbose output. There are some things that it will migrate by default that I don't need. So I'm going to exclude audits, central management server, and extended events. If there is change data capture, I don't want to move that. I don't want to move replication. Okay. And then we're going to call this start DBA migration, dbatools command with those parameters, and it's going to do all of that for us. Okay. Now, before we run that, let's take a look at the dbatools site. And let me go to that in my browser. When you go to dbatools, you get their kind of main page. If you go to either commands or docs, that's going to give you the list of everything. Commands is nice because it has them categorized, right? So there's all these commands available to you. But if you look up here, you have links to these different areas, backup and restore. I'm dealing with availability groups, policy-based management, diagnostics and performance. Here's the agent stuff over here, right? And they're all categorized that way. So for our purposes today, if we go look at migration, these are all the migration related commands, right? And notice that they all start with copy. Also, just as a convention, all of the DBA tools, the noun will be prefixed with DBA. So it's verb noun, it's PowerShell, right? But it's going to be DBA something or other. And they have a pretty good naming convention, right? So anything related to agent, you know, if we go over here to agent, agent alert, agent job category, agent job history, everything has agent as part of the name, right? So if you're going and saying, hey, I need to find what commands DBA tools has for SQL agent, those are easy to find. For some reason, and I don't know the answer as to why, the docs sometimes seem to be more up to date than the commands. So the commands page is good because it's categorized like that. But say I click on one of these and that one worked, right? It takes me to the documentation page for that. But what I've seen, some of them, when you click on it, it'll say there's no documentation. But if you go to docs, which is just where we just were, they're all just out here, and click on it, it's there. So it's just kind of a quirk of how the DBA tools site works. And so there you have it. The other thing that's really cool about this, if I go to that start DBA migration, we'll look at that one since that's the one that we're using. If I can spell, do my alphabet. Start DBA migration. They're very well documented, which is great. You know, the syntax, all the things that it's going to do, examples, you know, like really most PowerShell stuff, right? But one of the things, this is an open source project, right? It's all out there on GitHub. So if you want to understand, you know, because a lot of people are like, well, this is cool, but I don't want to just start using this module in my environment without understanding what it does. So if you click on this one here, it's going to take you right to the GitHub repository to the PowerShell script that's for that function. So, you know, you can go through that. You can see exactly what it's doing. And this particular one, what it's going to do is, this is all error checking. But if we get to where it starts to do the actual work, copy DBA SP configure, copy DBA custom error, copy DBA credential, copy DBA DB mail. All of this command is a wrapper for all of those other copy commands, right? So I could just as easily have written my script. So if we go back to my script where I said I want to exclude audits, central management server, and extended events, I could have written my script and done the exact same thing with individual copy commands, and I wouldn't have needed to exclude those, right? But you know, for this demo, that would be harder to say we're going to do this with one click or one small command to migrate all of this stuff. So the other thing that I mentioned, and this is just a great shortcut in PowerShell in general. If I say get command and give it a module that I have loaded, it's going to give me a list of all the commands that are available in that module. Well, if I then take that and send it to a grid view, then I get this, which I can sort, but I can also go up here and say, I care about SQL agent. So I'm going to type agent. Now it gave me everything with agent in the name, or I can add other criteria as well. So I use this a lot. In fact, I have an alias in my PowerShell profile on my normal machine that I just put in like 2 letters and it pops up that grid view so that I can find the command that I'm looking for. Okay, should we try it? Let me run those, and then I'm going to run just this entire splat to set all that up. One of the things I like about PowerShell is it's interactive within a session. So if you set a variable and you execute that, it's available to you. So if I say source instance, it tells me the value of source instance. How I wish there was a way to do that in T-SQL, right? How many times are we debugging or developing something and we've got variables and we have to remember to declare the variable, set it, and run our code all in one batch. So if I look at the contents of Splat, we can see all the values that I gave it. Now, these names here are all parameters for the start DBA migration command. All I've done is make it easier to type the command, right? If I have something in my hash table that's not here, that's not one of these, or a typo in one, or whatever the case may be, it's going to come back and it's going to say that's not a parameter that I'm familiar with. So just to see that, if I said start DBA migration with my tab completion, so we have a source, a destination, are we using detach, attach, or backup, restore? What's our shared path? With replace, no recovery, etc. Right? It's all these same things that we set here. We could set right on the command line. So let's give it a shot. I'm going to press F8 and it is telling me all the things that it's doing. Remember, I used verbose so that we could see all the pieces, and it looks like there are some warnings and there are errors. So we'll see what it missed. It's finally gotten to the databases, which takes some time, right? Because it's going to back up to that shared path and restore. And we're just going to let that run for a moment. While we're waiting on that, any questions about any of this, really? Migrations, DBA tools, or even just PowerShell in general? Wow, I am really good at this. I explained that so well that everyone's ready to go use this. Just kidding. Notice it does everything in the correct order, right? It's not going to try to, set permissions for a login that it hasn't copied yet. So it's smart enough to do that.
Interesting. I did see something flash by on your screen that I was surprised by, which was grant connect to built-in administrators.
Yeah, and what I didn't do for this that I normally would do is build a list of logins, right? So that I can exclude those. It doesn't really matter because if it already exists on the other server, by default, it will fail. I can tell it that I want it to copy it, but anyway, there's the output of everything that it did. And it tells me what was successful. Oh, here are some things that are going to require a restart. Here's a great example. This is a sysconfiguration, AWE enabled. If you've been doing SQL Server for a long time, like I have, you remember in 32-bit operating systems having to use extended memory. And there was something called AWE that was a SQL Server configuration that you had to turn on. Well, that doesn't exist in 2019. And I could go look up and tell you when it was deprecated. But there's an example of something that says, hey, I skipped this because it doesn't exist. It really doesn't matter, right? And there's a couple of those in the configuration, okay? Let's see. Look up for the file. So which instance is that on? Let's take a look. Those are read-only now, because that's what we told it to do. What am I doing? I can't even say that it's late like it is for you guys because I'm on the West Coast. So we have, yeah, so we are missing some volumes. That's interesting. These are VMs on a lab machine that normally don't run. I just started them today. I should have gone and made sure on that. But in any case, we have all the drives now. So if we go back to our PowerShell, at our list of commands, we can see that, oh, those 3 databases all failed because of the drive issue, okay? So we can come back and fix that. Skip the current login, skip the local machine. There's some user schemas that it went ahead and created. The agent alerts, schedules. How cool is that, right? You know, scheduling with the agent. Anybody who's tried to script that and automate generating a certain schedule, it's not for the faint of heart. And jobs, okay? So pretty much everything worked except for the databases themselves, which is kind of ironic. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna go grab this and we're gonna say, and I just had one database here. So just for fun, we'll run it with just that one database. So there are 3 databases that we wanna move. AdventureWorks DW 2008 R2, and SSG, and none of those exist here yet. So I'm going to run this for just SSG so that we can see how that works. Failed to restore. There's things on that drive that it didn't have. Delete those files. Let's make sure it doesn't have any data files either. That should just be system databases now. Okay. All right, let's try that again. Okay, that says that database was successful. And if I go over here, I see I now have, let's see, let me get over to the 2019. Oh, the database is read-only because it was read-only when I backed it up, right? Normally it would not be. So let me, at least for these other 2 databases, I'm going to turn the read-only back off. And we'll see that they're going to end up writable on the other side. So we'll go to and we'll go back here. And let's say VentureWorks, comma. So that's one of the cool things about these PowerShell parameters is you can give it an array of strings to specify multiple. And in fact, this wouldn't make sense in this particular command, but there's common parameters on a lot of these, like SQL instance, source, destination, depending upon what it is. So, you can do things on many instances at the same time by just giving it a list of those instance names rather than just one. But let's go ahead and run that for those two databases. And we'll see that that is complete. And now if we go to the 2019 instance, what did I just do? There we go. Come on. So if I refresh that, I have all three of my databases. If I look at the logins, it copied all the logins from the other server, both Windows logins and standard logins. The standard logins were copied with their passwords, with the same SIDs. So you're not going to have orphan user issues because it copies the SID. If we go to agent, we can see we got all our maintenance jobs. They're disabled. They have their steps. They have their schedules. They even have their notifications set up, which maybe we didn't have any there for that. We got our default alerts. We got our operator, right? So we did not get our operator. Interesting. Oh, we did. There we go. It's there. So like most demos and presentations like this, that's obviously, pretty contrived, right? A couple of small databases, few logins that were set up. And in a real world environment, there's a lot more things that you take into account and you spend a lot of time with your scripting. But at the end of the day, you're going to do the same thing. When it comes time to do your migration go live, you're just going to execute one script and it should be able to do everything for you. Okay, we'll open it up for questions at the end. If there's anything, I'll stick around as long as you guys like. Just wanted to point out, we have a couple, we try to do a webinar once a month. And so these are the ones that we have coming up in April and May. I'll be doing my But It Worked in Dev presentation in April, talking about some gotchas that people need to stay away from in their SQL code. And then in May, one of my senior consultants is doing a webinar on hybrid high availability. So maybe you have, the idea is you have an availability group on premise and you want to extend that to Azure with an asynchronous replica, that type of thing. So we'll be talking about using the hybrid cloud for HA and DR. Okay, that brings up the Q&A, and I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And if there's any questions or things that you want to talk about, I'm here. And if not, then we'll be done a few minutes early here.
Yeah, one question I had is, it's a very common scenario where, user screws up data in one table, and you go through the whole rigmarole of, restoring a backup to a different server and getting to that table. And I did answer my own question by looking through the DBA tool docs. It appears there is a copy DBA DB table data command. So that would be something you could use to, fix the data on that other table, or take that data that's good and just slurp it over and rewrite over. So awesome.
Yep.
It's a
The
huge
reason
pain.
I have that get commands for DBA tools is because there are some things that I say, hey, I need to do this. I'm going to go see if there's a command for it. And most of the time there is, right? Occasionally there'll be one. And, you know, probably what I should do is contribute to the project for those, right? But yeah, it's powerful. I mean, this demo kind of illustrated that. You know, we did what would be an awful lot of work scripting or manually doing things very easily. And, you know, there's commands that do things like, if you do use the Hallengren maintenance plans, there's an install DBA maintenance plan, DBA tool. It will go download the script from GitHub, create the procs, create everything in your database, create your jobs. And what we've done for our maintenance plans is we take that and we wrap it, because we have some additional jobs that we create for maintenance. And we also have a way that we create the schedules, which, you know, his stuff does not. So it's pretty powerful.
Trying to use SSMS to copy data is a huge pain in the butt, you know, to
Right.
export the data out. And then
I'll tell you another one that, you know, SSMS, SSIS, however you're doing it, that's a huge pain. And I don't know why Microsoft hasn't made it easier. Excel, right? Importing an Excel file, exporting an Excel file. There is a PowerShell module out there, open source, called Import Excel, which is awesome. I use that thing probably every day. It imports and exports. You can use it on a server that you don't have Excel installed on, right? So, you know, how often do we have people that, oh, I need to install Excel on this production server?
well, is that the module too? I think I've been using that, because you can set up filters right off the bat and even insert charts and do like everything.
Oh yeah, it's hardcore. Yeah,
it's like three commands. You slurp the data, do all this, and just it works fantastically. Yeah. Much better than trying
PowerShell, right? I mean, that's just what it does. So
for anybody out there who has used some PowerShell to try to do Excel, the standard Microsoft way is to basically, like, you're basically launching Excel in the background, or basically it's using the Excel objects. Like, to insert a row takes a second.
Right. And you have to have Excel on the machine that you're running on.
Yep. Right. You have to have it and have it licensed and all that jazz. Yeah. When it's a known file format. Yeah. So yeah, the import Excel module is awesome. I agree 100%.
Yep. Cool. Anybody else?
What's the biggest hurdle you've discovered for people newly to this practice for using DBA tools, besides the 600 plus commands?
Yeah,
obviously.
I think so I guess my follow-up question would be, new to PowerShell or just new to DBA tools? If it's new to PowerShell, then I'd say PowerShell, right? That it's a scripting language that you need to know how to use. You know, things like how I did the parameters in the hash table, the pipeline, how the pipeline works. You know, you don't have to be a PowerShell guru, but, you know, I'd start with, you know, PowerShell. The other thing that I wanted to mention, Chrissy Lemaire, who is the owner of that open source project, and you'll see has written many of those commands, is kind of the one that started DBA tools. Either it just came out or is coming out. There's a series of books that's like learn such and such in 30 lunches type of thing. And she's coming out with a book on DBA tools. It's let me look it up, because I did a terrible.
It's actually at the bottom of the website. I see it. Articles, learn DBA tools in a month of lunches.
Yep.
So and I was leaning more towards DBA tools itself more than PowerShell, but
Yep. So I would say that there is a DBA tools Slack channel that, you know, if you're not familiar, there's a SQL Server community workspace in Slack, and there's tons of channels. And so if you join that workspace, you can join that channel and talk to people in there. It's just in general, I think, becoming, pretty prevalent. So even like the SQL help hashtag on Twitter, if you asked the DBA tools question there, you'd probably get an answer. So
Note on that book, it's actually been partially released. They're doing on the incremental release thing, if you what they call that. But so you can buy it now and have all the available chapters that are out so far.
okay, cool. I honestly, I just remember her tweeting about it, and I have been wanting to check out the book, and I haven't. So
That's actually shortcutted even on that article link on the page itself too. So I'm just, as you're mentioning it, keep following the breadcrumbs.
hey, if it's your book and you run the website, why not, right?
Right.
So yeah, but cool. Oh, I see. Yeah, so they are kind of releasing it over time. So cool stuff. The best
Curious.
part is you can start using DBA tools and not tell your boss, and you just got yourself a bunch of free time, right?
Pull a Scotty, I kept it, it'll take me 12 hours, and-
That's right. Oh, I got to script out all those jobs,
Question for you on support for PowerShell on Linux. Does it have a whole section for the Linux-based stuff, containers, or is they still mostly Windows-based stuff?
I've not used it on Linux, so I don't know the answer to that. I would guess that it's going to be a function of SMO, right? Because it's using SQL management objects under the hood. So, depending upon, because there's some SMO functionality that you have available, but not all of it, right? So that's an interesting question. I should play with that.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of PowerShell for probably 10 plus years on Windows, but I've just got to start branching out to see what that's going to look like on Linux.
Yep. Oh, look at that. DBA tools and SQL on Linux. There you go. An article by Chrissy telling you exactly what works and doesn't. So cool.
Good enough. Thank you.
I'm not even the one that found it. Someone else did.
That was me, but yeah. The magic of Google.
Yep.
You had mentioned, kind of in the do's and don'ts sections, always having to, be concerned about max DOP, max mem. Those are two pretty big obvious ones. Number of temp tables comes up in my head too. What do you do in those cases? Do you just let it copy over and then fix it afterwards? Or, what is your methodology on that?
I typically, for the sys configurations, I would be very surgical about any of those that I want it to copy, right? So I, set up the target environment the way I want it to start with, and probably not copy most of those things. But it's even just from an analysis standpoint, right? Because there's things that, I can't tell you how many times I see CLR enabled and they're not using CLR assemblies, right? I mean, just really look at all those and see what you need. The other thing is, and granted, there's a few different formulas out there for, how many temp DB files should you have, or what should your max memory be. But there are DBA tools commands. There's one that's test DBA max mem and set DBA max mem that uses, one of the more common formulas to figure that out. So same thing with max stop. And so those are good. Just, I tell people with both of those things, it's a starting point, right? It really depends on your environment. I did a health check for a customer last week that, their max mem set was set well under what the formula would say, but they're still seeing lots of memory pressure, right? And well, it turns out they're using the CLR, and they've got some CLR assemblies that hammer away and use a lot of memory, right? So you've got to take that into account. So I tell people in general with max mem, start more conservative and bump it up rather than vice versa. But
yeah, I guess the most important thing is to ask the question, right? And keep, you know,
Exactly.
yeah.
I mean, well, that's the other thing we see a lot, right? When we go into an environment, right? Is that we see all the SQL servers that the maximum hasn't been set, right? So it's at that, 2 billion, whatever.
Yeah, two terabytes. Yeah. So if we could all have that much memory on our database servers, that'd be awesome. But,
Exactly.
Yeah. I wish there was a check for this, but I just had a production server where I work, and I'm actually not the DBA where I work. I'm actually a manager, but I used to be a DBA in my past life. But we had one of our production servers that was running not one but 2 different virus scanners on it, and nobody had done any exclusions whatsoever. And we're having tons of performance problems. And this is our production SAP database. And once they got rid of it, poof, magic, all the problems went away. It was like, well, yeah,
there are
duh.
2 or 3 things that are at the top of my list of like, this is the stuff that will kill your performance without you even thinking about it inside SQL Server, right? Virus scans, one of them. VM snapshots, right? If you got some snapshots sitting out there that it's having to maintain. And then the other one that more often than not, nobody's looked at it, is the power plan on the server.
We ran into that. Power management was set to default.
Yeah,
And
the default
all of a
is
sudden
balanced.
we set it up to high and just no more bottlenecks.
Yeah, it's a huge one, and people find that kind of shocking, but it is what it is.
Yeah, we were shocked at that because we didn't build the servers, we just maintained the SQL server on it.
Yep.
That in their template for the VMs, they missed that setting. And of course we didn't look at it. So that one quick change by Nem's prodigy made a world of difference.
That was Russ. Awesome.
It was Russ.
I wouldn't call him my prodigy. He's a coworker.
Oh, he surpassed you?
It's actually great to hear, because I tell people that all the time, when we do health checks. I mean, we've seen, that and the disk configuration stuff, 64K sectors versus 4K, and making sure that we have separate virtual controllers, like 50% improvement, just those 2 things. And what happens a lot of the time, people have really high-end hardware and the infrastructure is put together right. But if your VM configuration and your OS configuration and your SQL configuration aren't correctly for that, you're not using it, right? So, we're seeing all these IO stalls and we're on NVMe. I don't get it. Well, there's a whole bunch of pieces between your database and that flash storage, right? So, cool stuff. All right. Well, Adam's got my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me. Website is SQLSolutionsGroup.com. Thanks for coming, and hope that it was of some value for all of you.